Well, good morning, and welcome to ITIF's event on global trade independence, U.S. trade linkages with Mexico, Taiwan, and Korea. I'm Stephen Ezel. I'm the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy here at ITIF, and I'll be the first presenter and moderator today. What I'll do is present about our report for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then turn it over to what, as always, is an all-star panel at an ITIF event. We're delighted this morning to have Charles Bustani, Jimmy Goodrick, and Tammy Overby, and I will formally introduce them after my remarks as they come up to speak. But for those who don't know, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan science and technology policy think tank based here in Washington, D.C., actually ranked by the University of Pennsylvania Global Go-To Think Tank Index as the world's leading science and technology policy think tank in 2018. And we work on innovation policy across a wide variety of sectors of the economy, from clean energy and life sciences to information technology. So we're here today because global supply chains matter greatly to the global economy, maximizing production and value. In fact, more than 2/3 of world trade occurs through global value chains, in which production of a final good or service crosses at least one border, and typically many borders, before final assembly. If you consider the semiconductor industry, for instance, the typical semiconductor production process spans at least 4 countries, 4 U.S. states, over 3 trips around the world in 100 days, covering 25,000 miles, as a semiconductor ingot is moved into a wafer, is moved into an actual chip that goes into your mobile phone or your car. This internationalization of supply chains means that the success of original equipment manufacturers, whether an Intel, a Boeing, or a General Motors, depends greatly on the health and vitality of suppliers in other nations and the ability to trade effectively with them. And in particular, in key high-tech industries, most of America's most valuable suppliers are found in countries like Mexico, Korea, and Taiwan. So what our report does, and there are copies outside, is it takes a very deep dive, providing a treasure trove of information on the nature of U.S. trade with Mexico, Taiwan, and Korea, looking at a number of trade indicators such as trade and value added, intra-industry trade and value added, the composition of product trade between capital, intermediate, or final goods, the domestic value-added content as a share of countries' gross exports and imports, intra-industry level trade and value added across 6 key industries: automobiles, chemicals, computers and electronics, machinery, pharmaceuticals, and other transportation equipment like aerospace, and other attributes like domestic value added as a share of gross exports and imports by industry. Now, I know you're all excited to hear that I have slides for every single one of these 7 types of data flows. That's actually not true, but I actually only do have a couple. This chart here shows U.S. trade with these 3 nations in gross terms, value-added terms, and on an intra-industry basis. Okay, question. Does everybody understand what trade and value added means? Does anybody not understand what trade and value added means? Very well. Essentially, what we're referring to by trade and value added is the share of content that is added domestically into a product or service that goes out into international markets for export. So if you think about a mobile phone that's manufactured in China, essentially about 1/3 of the value added is coming from the assembly activity in parts and components contributed by Chinese manufacturers. 2/3 of that value is coming from other parts and inputs that were created in other parts of the world, whether it is the memory disk in Korea or the semiconductor chip in the United States. So essentially, trade and value added is looking at when we adjust for the nature of production, where is this value really flowing from the global economy? That's as deep as we're going to go into economics today, I assure you. 2 points I want to make here about this chart, though. First is that the U.S. trade deficit with Taiwan actually narrowed between 2002 and 2014. And I want to focus, for a lot of this presentation, on intra-industry trade in those 6 industries I mentioned. Because what we're going to see is that the United States, while it does have an aggregate trade balance, a trade deficit with these countries on a broad trade basis, when we look at trade in advanced technology industries, the US actually performs very strongly. So for instance, when we look specifically at US trade with Taiwan on this intra-industry basis, and here what we're referring to is trade in value added of intermediate goods within the same industry. So this is, for instance, Taiwanese ICT firms purchasing components or production equipment from US ICT companies. So we're examining trade within a sector such as pharmaceuticals or machinery or chemicals. And for instance, what we see here with Taiwan is that the US runs these very strong intra-industry trade balances all across chemicals, pharmaceuticals, machinery, and aerospace equipment. It's the same story here with Korea, where we run strong trade balances in chemicals, in pharmaceuticals, in machinery, in aerospace. And even the same here with Mexico across a lot of these industries. This is all the big tables we're going to see in this presentation, I assure you. But the key point I really want to emphasize is that America has extremely positive trade balances with these countries across these high-tech industries. Let's talk about the nature of trade with some of these key countries. First, looking at US-Mexico trade. As I'm sure you know, bilateral US-Mexico trade reached almost $700 billion in 2018, making Mexico America's 3rd largest trading partner and 2nd largest goods importer. US trade with Mexico is truly vital to our economy, supporting 6 million jobs, over 1.7 million which have been attributable to NAFTA, the trade agreement. Trade actually attributable to NAFTA supports at least 10,000 jobs in each of the 50 US states and over 100,000 US jobs in 17 states. But the key point about the nature of US-Mexico trade that this report wants to make is that value chains are deeply integrated. In fact, if you look at the production of automobiles across North America, essentially the parts involved towards production of a final automobile vehicle cross North American borders 8 times toward final assembly of a product. For medical devices, a medical device in Mexico has parts and components that cross the US-Mexico border 10 times towards production of a final medical device. And when we look at the share of US inputs that go into finished manufactured goods exported from Mexico to the United States, we see that 40% of the value added of those finished goods actually originated in the United States. That's actually 10 times higher than China's share, which is just 4%. Trade is deeply integrated between our 2 countries. And in fact, the US and Mexico form what economists call a high-wage, low-wage partnership, bringing complementary labor forces, innovation capacity, and industries together to create a region where the US and Canada can focus on some of the higher value-added R&D design work, and we have a more lower-cost competitive labor environment in Mexico that can do some of the assembly work. Essentially, what the administration should be thinking about is not making America great again, but actually about making North America great again, and thinking about how we can create a region of the world that's more effective to compete globally in advanced technology marketplaces. In fact, if we were smart, what we really should be doing is talking to Foxconn about bringing 100,000 jobs to Mexico or Honduras and reimagining the nature of global value chains to take care of other types of immigration problems we have in the North Americas. So we could be thinking far more geostrategically at this current geopolitical moment about how we reshape global value chains in a way that really advantages North America. Turning the attention of the discussion to our friends in Taiwan and Korea. And what we have here actually in Taiwan is the country that is the 2nd most dependent in the world on participation in global value chains. In fact, 70% of Taiwan's total exports feed into global value chains for finished products. And this is actually 5th for Korea. So 2 of the countries in the world most dependent on participation in global value chains for their economies. A concern, though, as this chart reveals, is that when we look at countries' share of world manufacturing income from participation in global value chains, we see that this has actually decreased for Korea, Taiwan, and the United States from 1995 to 2011, in many cases by significant amounts. US decline of 5%, declines for Korea and Taiwan. Where is that share of global value chain manufacturing value added being captured? In China, where their share of GVC income in manufacturing increased 400% between 1995 and 2011. But looking more specifically at US-Taiwan trade, we have bilateral trade that reached $86 billion in 2017. America is Taiwan's second largest trading partner and its largest source of FDI. Conversely, Taiwan is America's 11th largest trading partner, 13th largest source of imports, and 14th most significant export destination. From 2000 to 2017, total US exports to Taiwan grew by 8%, while imports from Taiwan grew by just 2% over that period. And US trade with Taiwan supported 210,000 US jobs in 2015. So while these kind of base trade statistics matter, they actually don't do justice to the true significance of the Taiwanese economy to the US economy. As this report from CRS pointed out, quote, US data on trade with Taiwan may understate the importance of Taiwan to the US economy because of the role of global value chains. And the fact is that the US has deeper inter-industry trade linkages with Taiwan than almost any other East Asian trade partner, with a percentage of Taiwan's exports feeding into the US global supply chain greater than those from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand all combined together. Put simply, Taiwanese headquartered enterprises play key roles in the manufacture of intermediate components and a final assembly for a wide range of goods, from semiconductors and laptops to desktops and mobile phones. And that's shown very clearly, my last slide here, except for policy recommendations, from the example of the semiconductor industry, which I know my colleague Jimmy will talk further about. But what trade with Taiwan has done is enabled US firms to engage in what's called a fabless foundry business model, wherein US companies specialize in the most high value-added sectors of semiconductor activity, such as chip design, R&D, kind of developing the design of the chips, thinking about how they can be deployed in vehicles or the Internet of Things. But then they contract with Taiwanese partners who specialize in manufacturing, assembly, testing, and packaging much more cheaply, allowing our companies to specialize in the highest stages of value-added activity. And essentially what this shows here, I won't go through all these charts, essentially US semiconductor companies account for 65% of global demand for this fabless foundry model. And Taiwanese companies fulfill 73% of the market for it. At the same time, Taiwan's actually a very important consumer of many sectors of US semiconductor output. In fact, consuming 30% of our exports of the machines that make semiconductors themselves, machines from Applied Materials or KLA Tencor, for instance. So the key point here is that trade with these countries enables our companies to have innovative business models that have kept them in the global lead in a number of industries. Okay, to conclude with policy recommendations. First, yes, we need to pass the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Congrats to our Mexican partners for having done that last week. Hopefully, we will see the light and do so ourselves this summer or in the fall. Secondly, we need to move beyond the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement and actually pursue a US-Taiwan free trade agreement. One economic analysis of the benefit of a US-Taiwan FTA, assuming zero tariffs on commodity trade and at least a 25% liberalization of service trade, found that a US-Taiwan FTA could increase real US GDP by $3.5 billion annually, decrease the US trade deficit with Taiwan by 75%, and result in the generation of an additional 27,000 US jobs per year. Let's do a free trade agreement. Third, we need to join the CPTPP and support Taiwan's participation in it. Frankly, it was a serious strategic error on the part of the Trump administration to withdraw from the TPP. If we are going to seriously suggest that our companies should be looking at alternative global production locations to China, we should be giving them attractive environments in which they could do so. our participation with member countries in the TPP would go a long way strategically to make that happen. We need to continue to confront Chinese innovation mercantilism, as ITIF has written in numerous reports. We must insist that China abide by the rules of rules-governed, market-based, and enterprise-led trade as it committed to do so when it joined the World Trade Organization. And finally, as the administration considers introducing export controls on EFTs, or emerging and foundational technologies, we must tread lightly and only do so in cases where the national security of the United States is seriously impugned, and absolutely be certain that we are not introducing export controls on products that are available at a similar level of innovation from competitors. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and now turn it over to our wonderful panel of guest speakers. We'll start with Charles Bastani. Charles is a counselor at the National Bureau of Asian Research and the inaugural chairholder of the Center for Innovation, Trade, and Strategy at NBR. Congressman Bastani retired from the Congress after serving from 2005 to 2017, where he represented Louisiana's 7th and 3rd congressional districts and served on the House Ways and Means Committee and the Subcommittee on Tax Policy. As many of you know, prior to Congress, Charles was in the private practice of medicine as a thoracic and cardiovascular surgeon in Louisiana. After Charles, we'll hear from Tammy Overby. Tammy is a senior director at McLarty Associates. She joins McLarty after 3 decades of work in Asia, including 21 years living in Seoul. She had led the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Asian team and served as president of the U.S. Korea Business Council. She oversaw the U.S. Coalition for TPP and has worked with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on its various APEC efforts over the years. She had a 14-year tenure as president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, and today she sits on the board of the Korea Society and the International Student Council, as well as the Korea Institute Advisory Council, Korea Economic Institute Advisory Council. And last but not least, we will hear from Jimmy Goodrick, who was a vice president for global policy at SIA, the Semiconductor Industry Association. Prior to joining SIA, Jimmy served as director of global policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, ITIC. Before joining ITIC, Jimmy was the director for Greater China Government Affairs at Cisco Systems. He's worked at IPCO Worldwide and sits on the board of UCITO, the U.S. Information Technology Office in Beijing. Jimmy is fluent in Mandarin and lived in China for 7 years. So we have great experts on all manner of East Asian trade. So with that, Charles, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Let me start by congratulating you and ITIF on an outstanding report. I've had the opportunity to read a number of reports on trade and what's happening with global value chains, and this is one of the clearest, most lucid reports I have read to date. And it's really important, I think, for American policymakers to understand what the findings are in this report. So I urge you to take the time to read this report. It is lengthy. I know you all have time constraints. But
there's an executive summary outside.
But there is a good executive summary. But I urge you to read the full report because the data in this is very compelling, and it will help you provide advice more broadly as policy is being made. I think this is, if we're looking at trade policy, more broadly foreign economic policy, and ultimately strategy, you really need to understand the circumstances that you're dealing with to get the right policies. And I think that's where American policy right now in this whole area has gone astray. This analysis clearly demonstrates the depth of our U.S. relations with these 3 countries across 6 key sectors. It illustrates the importance of understanding that U.S. trade flows with these countries and with other countries as well, but specifically with these 3 countries, should not be looked at just in terms of aggregate trade balances. You really need to understand what's happening at the value-added level, and value-added level, not only gross or in general terms, but value added by industry to get a true snapshot of how important this is, because you'll realize underneath the gross numbers There are profound differences, but equally important relations that the U.S. has with Mexico versus with Taiwan or Korea. So it's important, and you can learn this by looking at this paper and understanding what's really behind these numbers, because they show on a much deeper level how trade specialization in industrial production among nations through global value chains really enables U.S. competitiveness in the long run. Stephen, in his report, did an outstanding job of putting together these several data sets pertaining to these trade balances in value-added terms, both overall and by industry for these three countries. So I really urge you to read the report. If you're going to pick something substantive and more deeply to read, this is one you should read. A key finding is that though the United States is highly exposed to the global economy, a large percentage of its exports contain substantial amounts of U.S. Manufactured value-added components. And also, what America imports contains a relatively large proportion of U.S. value-added coming back into the country, more than 4 times higher than for any of the 3 countries that we're dealing with. And you won't see that in the aggregate trade balance numbers, but if you look at these numbers more deeply, as he's broken down in the report, you'll see this. It truly illustrates the strength of American innovation. And I think of particular interest is the case of Taiwan in advanced technology production. Stephen mentioned that Taiwan is the second most dependent country in the world with regard to global value chains. This participation in global value chains, as Stephen pointed out, is what is allowing for business models to be put together for U.S. advanced technology companies to really be competitive. And I know Jimmy's really going to go into more detail on this in the semiconductor space. But this, at its very heart of it all, this is much more important than just the commercial importance and the commercial impact for the United States. It is of strategic importance. And let me explain a little further why that's the case. Because right now, as you're thinking about, what's going on with China, understanding what Stephen has outlined in this paper is critical to your understanding of what our policy responses should be. Consider that since 1995, the world manufacturing global value chain income fell for Japan, for Korea, for Germany, Taiwan, the United States, reflecting the 4-fold increase that happened in China during that same time period. And this is in shares of global value chains. So you might think, okay, well, what's the big deal with regard to that? Well, first off, China is increasingly trying to squeeze Taiwan out of global value chains, and it is also posing a threat in the technology space to Korean, German, and American participation in these global value chains, all on the basis of mercantilist trade policies, IP theft, technology transfer, subsidies, the things you've been all focused on in our relationship with China. The most effective way of dealing with this is to implement policies that deepen trade linkages with like-minded market economies. So if you step back for a minute and think about international relations theory, and you think about, in the absence of a broad consensus for commercial trade and commercial interactions, and how we use technology, which is changing so quickly. In the absence of consensus among the countries under, say, WTO or globally, some sort of consensus, what happens? Well, you have China doing things very differently, so there's no consensus, and you end up with a real level of competition which devolves into a balance of power competition. And that's what we're seeing today. This competition is about who's going to set standards for trade and for technology use. China has its own views of this, and they have a well-defined strategy they've laid out through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is not just in Central Asia, it's global. And it's about creating the standards. And so their involvement, their deep involvement in global value chains is where this is going to play out. That's why the Korean trade agreement, a high-level, high-ambition trade agreement, was so important. That's why passing USMCA is more important than just the simple commercial elements to this. It's the IP standards, the digital trade standards that will help put the U.S. back in the game on driving standards. And that's why, ideally, a trade agreement with Taiwan would be so important to put the U.S. back on a solid footing in the region, along with the other recommendations Stephen made, especially TPP, and we can talk further about that. We also know that research and development intensive companies drive GDP growth. That's been fairly well established in the literature. And in fact, the Department of Commerce had a study a few years ago that found that nearly 40% of U.S. GDP growth came from R&D intensive industries, innovative companies. And given that innovation benefits from global value chains, as research has shown, and that high level, and research has also shown that high level trade and investment agreements combined, not just a trade agreement, not just simply an investment agreement, you combine them and you put them at a high ambition level, such as what we see in USMCA or Chorus or what was in TPP. These types of agreements drive the creation of global value chains. So if the U.S. is not involved in these things, we're not involved in driving global value chain development to the extent we should be, and we're not involved to the extent we should be in creating standards. So let me put it in perspective for you. There are now over 400 trade agreements in existence today, and some of the latest ones that don't involve the U.S. are very high level. The United States is a party to 14 trade agreements with 20 countries. And the two biggest economies in those trade agreements are Canada with the old NAFTA and Korea. So we're falling behind. We need to do more. And that's why TPP was really important. That's why the work done on TTIP was so important. The balance of power is changing right now, and it's changing very rapidly in Asia. And it's being driven by economics and technology. And it's playing out in the development of global value chains. And I mentioned trade agreements. So think about two recent trade agreements that just went into effect this year. Japan has a trade agreement, a very high-level agreement with the EU. And concomitantly, Japan took the lead in getting CPTPP done with the remaining countries. Japan's at the nexus of all of this right now in global value chain creation. We don't need to be out of that, and Japan wants us in. The other countries in Asia want us in CPTPP. And if we were to do this, we would really up our leverage and our ability to shape global value chains in a way that we're not doing right now. American strategy requires us to take a lead in this around high standards. It's about building global value chains around high standards while minimizing our vulnerabilities within those global value chains to mercantilist trade practices and IP theft. Building those types of networks will shape the balance of power, and the recommendations in this report are sound in that they will promote the necessary linkages through high-ambition trade and investment agreements. So by expanding these trade linkages, deepening U.S. leadership in global value chains, what the U.S. will do will maximize its aggregate leverage in dealing with China's abusive practices while working with partners to minimize our vulnerabilities. That can be used to test China's capacity and will to reform, as opposed to trying to confront China head-on with coercive measures which are not going to go along with. And you're going to see this play out. We've done reports and we really analyze this. You need to build maximum aggregate leverage while minimizing our vulnerabilities. Get the EU, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, other like-minded market countries to play ball in this and to build leverage through global value chains that are relatively immune to infringement on IP practices. This is how the United States can shape the global balance of power with allies rather than resorting to mercantilist practices and other trade barriers that will ultimately hurt American innovation, American jobs, and American economic growth. So I applaud Stephen and ITIF again for this outstanding report. I recommend that you read it. The one caveat I would add to the recommendations, and I'm going to offer something provocative and aggressive. Not only should the U.S. seek to rejoin CPTPP, but we should consider using our leverage to bring Taiwan into it with us. That would create significant leverage. It would help provide some protection with regard to our vulnerabilities within these global value chains, and would really up our participation in global value chains to a higher level to shape the balance of power. So I'll stop there and be happy to take questions later. Thanks, Stephen.
Great. Thank you so very much, Charles. Tammy.
I thought Charles Boustany was an outstanding member of Congress, and I really enjoyed working with him on ratifying the Korea, Colombia, and Panama agreements. But, oh my gosh, I like him even more now that he can say exactly what he thinks. I agree with everything he said, but I have one small caveat. I think we should absolutely work to rejoin CPTPP. I think we should take Taiwan with us, but I think we should also take Korea with us. By strengthening the comprehensive, progressive, trans-Pacific partnership would allow the U.S. to have the sufficient leverage we need to really counterbalance what's happening with China. I'm going to now focus most of my remarks on U.S.-Korea. In 2017, South Korea was the U.S.'s sixth largest goods trading partner. Yes, we do have a deficit. In 2017, it was $23 billion, but it dropped last year to $17.8 billion, thanks to U.S. LNG exports. Korea is a strong need for imported energy. We have and continue to maintain a surplus on the services side to the tune of over $12 billion. Right now, the KORUS agreement is the largest free trade agreement, the highest standard free trade agreement. NAFTA's larger, but it hasn't yet been ratified. And I am also in the camp that we need to ratify USMCA as quickly as possible. I've been doing trade in Asia for 30 years, and if you're not part of a trade agreement, a preferential trade agreement, you're on the outside. And if you're on the outside, you're losing. And if you don't believe me, ask America's farmers today who are on the outside of Japan in the CPTPP agreement, Mexico, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Their farmers have better access to the Japanese market today than American farmers. Also, as Charles mentioned, the high standard comprehensive Japan-EU free trade agreement. Again, if you're not part of that preferential agreement, you're stuck on the outside looking in, and that is not where America should be. But unfortunately today it is. It's a reality, and we've got to change it. KORUS is in force. It's a high standard agreement. Contrary to what our president used to say, that it was the worst job-killing agreement ever and needed to be renegotiated, I'll let you know that as former president of the U.S. Korea Business Council, and from my position as senior vice president and head of the U.S. Chamber's Asia program, that's not what our company said. Our company said the agreement was working. Again, it provided high IP protections, strong rule of law, enforcement dispute settlement mechanisms that worked. So no one from the U.S. business community was calling for the renegotiation. But okay, we renegotiated it. We made very minor changes. The only material change in that amending process was Hyundai Motors will never sell a light truck in America. The South Koreans allowed us 20 more years of a 25% light truck tariff. So that was really the big win that came out of that. And oh, by the way, Hyundai's not selling light trucks, but you know it was still a win. Are you tired of winning yet? But what KORUS did, when I went to Korea and started working there in 1988, American companies said it was one of the hardest markets in Asia to do business, and it was true. Korea at that time was a command-controlled economy. The Korean government chose the winners and losers. 96, Korea decided to join the OECD. They began to open up. 97, 98, they got hit with a terrible economic flu. and they had to apply to the IMF for a big loan, and they began to really fundamentally change their economy, which when they reached out to the U.S. in 2005 and said, Korea would like to negotiate a comprehensive, high-standard free trade agreement with America. Most Americans were like, we're kind of skeptical. Your government has such a heavy hand in business. But there were 18 months, 5 preparatory rounds where Wendy Cutler went chapter by chapter of what she would want to see in a high-standard comprehensive agreement. And the Koreans, they said, yes, let's do it. So we completed a high standard agreement, and it has worked. Now, has it worked as much as the U.S. business community said it would? No. We clearly oversold it. We also didn't expect that in 2009 there would be a global financial challenge. And I would argue that while we haven't seen the growth in Korea that we wanted to see, that growth was significantly more than it would have been if we didn't have KORUS. KORUS has absolutely helped us. Also, KORUS has given Korea a lot of confidence. The first FTA the Republic of Korea did was with Chile, and they chose Chile very strategically because opposite hemisphere, different growing seasons. They anticipated their farmers would have issues, but 10 years after the Chilean agreement was in force, I asked all my Korean friends, what do you think of the Korea-Chile free trade agreement? And all they can say is, oh, Chile makes great wine. It's delicious. And it's more affordable thanks to the FTA. Today, Korea, like many countries around the world, has become very aggressive in free trade agreements. They've got free trade agreements with all of their major partners, with Canada, with China, with the U.S., with the EU. But they don't have one with Japan. When the U.S. was leading TPP, we tried to get Korea to enter. They had a new government. They had what they characterized as FTA fatigue, so they didn't join. And they regret that now. And now they're concerned. They would very much like to join CPTPP, but there's a lot of historical baggage with Japan. And the U.S. is not there to sort of help them through, which is why my caveat for Charles's point. The value chains that we're seeing in Korea, again, Korea, it's a small country, roughly the size of the state of Indiana, 50 million people, no natural resources, but one thing, educated people. They have built global leaders in shipbuilding, semiconductors, electronics, autos, and they've done that, frankly, with under the protection of a U.S. security arrangement, and now with the U.S. free trade agreement, they've had preferential access to our markets. And they've benefited deeply from these supply chains and from rules-based trade. Gosh, he said everything so well, but he didn't tell you that the WTO came out with a 2019 Global Value Chain Development Report. And just a couple of the highlights. Global value chains have not, and I underline and capitalize, have not been a significant contributor to the decline in manufacturing jobs in advanced economies. And job gains in services have offset whatever losses there were in manufacturing. The emergence of global value chains have offered developing countries an opportunity to integrate into the global economy by delivering jobs and higher incomes. And the impact of new digital technologies on global value chains is still uncertain. Jury's still out. They may reduce the length of supply chains by encouraging reshoring of manufacturing, or they may strengthen global value chains by reducing coordination and matching costs between buyers and suppliers. And while small and medium-sized companies are underrepresented in global value chains, the digital economy does provide new opportunities for them to play a bigger role. And I'll end by highlighting that more open and transparent policies tend to promote global value chain-led growth, more than import-reducing policies or tariffs. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Tammy. Jimmy.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Again, I'd like to commend you as well for an excellent report. And there's not much left for me to say. I think a lot has been said by Charles and Tammy already. But what I'll try and do is provide a bit of context from an industry's perspective as to how global value chains benefit, in particular, one very strong American industry. So I represent the Semiconductor Industry Association, and it's a little-known fact that a lot of the world's components that go into your iPhone are actually, in many cases, produced right here or in Korea, Taiwan, and two of the countries that are pointed out here in this report. And the reason why that the U.S. semiconductor industry is so successful is because we were able to build and we rely on these global value chains that Stephen pointed out in his report. And just a couple of facts about the industry. The U.S. semiconductor industry accounts for 45% of the worldwide market, which is a $470 billion market. And I like Stephen's report because it references a report that we actually put out 2 years on the semiconductor global value chain called Beyond Borders. I encourage you to take a look at that as to one of the footnotes that's in here if you do get a chance. It really outlines in specifics where the global value chain for semiconductors specifically flows. Within the global value chain, that has evolved for our industry over several decades. And as Stephen highlighted, it's extremely complex. If you think about the process to manufacture a chip or design a chip, it starts from the idea, which is sometimes coming out of universities and institutes here in the United States or in our national labs. Then it's designed by engineers using complex software and supercomputers to lay out all the circuits, and the majority of that for U.S. companies happens in the United States. And then the chip is manufactured, and that process is extremely complex, and it goes around the world several times before your chip actually ends up being sold to a company like Apple or another company or Samsung or whomever that incorporates the chip into their phone. And that process is very globally aggregated with inputs coming from countries all around the world and outputs going to various different markets. Exports are very critical for the U.S. semiconductor industry. 80% of everything that we design and sell is sold overseas. And so access to markets is essential. Access to our supply chain is essential. Because of that, the U.S. semiconductor industry is still the fourth largest manufactured export, the fourth largest export overall. In fact, the U.S. exported more semiconductors in value than we did cars last year. And so that's a little known fact that actually, if you think about electronics, there's an impression that everything you buy from, Walmart or Best Buy is coming from China. But actually, the core value add of those electronics, the brains behind them, the semiconductors, many of them are still produced either in the United States or are, allied countries with high value add industries like Taiwan and South Korea, particularly highlighted here. Just to focus a little bit on why Taiwan and South Korea in particular make our industry here stronger. First, starting with Taiwan, as Stephen points out very clearly, the industry has evolved over the last several decades where, say, 30 years ago, every semiconductor company was doing the entire stack within its own company, vertically integrated. And some companies still do that today, like Intel. But in the 1980s in particular, a model emerged called the fabless foundry model, where companies would specialize in just the design of the chip, and they would contract the manufacturing out to a partner, which is called a foundry. And Taiwan really pioneered this with Morris Chang, the founder of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, actually was a partnership with Taiwan's ITRI, a government-run educational institute in Hsinchu, Taiwan. And this was a perfect example of Taiwan leveraging its highly skilled workforce, overseas returning Taiwanese, and knowledge of the global value chain. And today what they've built is a platform, a technology platform for where American companies, Korean, Japanese companies can take their complex designs and then manufacture them in Taiwan. And that allows them to share the cost of manufacturing across their entire industry set. Because today to build a new fab to manufacture chips, it roughly costs around $15 billion. And that's not a cost that every company can incur on its own. And by allowing them to specialize in design, the manufacturing foundry partners in Taiwan, like TSMC, allow companies here to be more innovative and pour more resources to design, research, and engineering, and stay ahead of our competitors in terms of chip design. The other interesting fact about Taiwan is they've also pioneered the outsourced called Semiconductor Assembly Test Model. And this is the final stage of semiconductor production where the wafer comes out of a factory, it's all chopped up, and then put into packages and sold. And Taiwanese companies dominate that and excel in technology. And that's actually really key for a lot of innovations for things like your iPhone today, where the more chips you can package in a very thin circuit board allows you to have thinner phones with better battery life. And that's a key innovation that Taiwanese companies have helped their American chip partners develop and pioneer in Taiwan. In addition, the other critical node within the supply chain, of course, is because of Taiwan's strength in semiconductor manufacturing, it's a top destination, as Stephen points out. 30% of exports of American capital equipment is going to Taiwan. Taiwan, on its own, spends more than $15–20 billion a year in semiconductor capital expenditures, and given the U.S. companies like Applied Materials, KLA, Tencor, Lam Research dominate that, it's a top export market. And so if it's American capital goods going in to support the manufacturing, Taiwanese company runs the platform, and then coming out of that are advanced American chip design. So the level of interaction, interdependence is incredible within Taiwan. In addition, Taiwan is also the production base for a number of American companies like Micron Technology, who's now the largest foreign investor in Taiwan and has acquired a number of previously struggling Taiwanese companies and made them very successful in developing DRAM and 3D NAND flash memory technology. So that's a very successful case of partnership between Taiwan and the United States in the industry as well. Finally, on Korea, obviously, South Korea is its own powerhouse in the semiconductor industry, particularly in memory chip technology. Samsung and SK Hynix, two incredibly competitive, dynamic companies. But it's more than just the competition in that both of them, again, are huge purchasers of that capital equipment that fuels the innovation cycle back here in the United States. And much like Apple, Samsung itself is the world's largest purchaser of semiconductors, for all of its demand for its flat panels, its cell phones, its laptops. And that's a huge and critical partner for U.S. semiconductor companies in Samsung, LG, and other companies there. And so the interdependence and the interaction that we have for our industry, the U.S. semiconductor industry, is incredible, and particularly the role that Taiwan plays, particularly for leveraging how successful U.S. fabless semiconductor companies are. It's really indispensable, and the U.S. would not be competitive today were it not for these global value chains. And that's why cooperation with our partners and allies, as Charles points out, is critical, particularly given that the policies that some governments are promoting for supply chain interdependence, particularly China, with its Made in China 2025 policy that came out in 2015, calling for all of these key industries that Korea, Taiwan, Mexico, the United States ourselves are competitive in, are interdependent in. China wants to be independent of us and create its own independent value chains. And that is a harm that will be placed upon all of us. And so I think it behooves the countries to work together, particularly as we need to do so to confront some of the challenges that China presents, particularly from supply chain localization, intellectual property protection, and from my conversations with our partners around the world, that partnership is easy to forge, and our allies are very willing to work with us. Given what's at stake for us is what's equally at stake for our partners. So look forward to the further discussion, Stephen, and I commend you again for an excellent report, and in particular calling out our industry, which is truly one of the most global industries and global value-added industries possible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jimmy. We have a couple seats up front if anybody would like to come and sit down. You can move that way. But yeah, anybody who'd like a seat, please join up front. I have a couple questions for our panelists, and then we'll open it up for the audience. My first would be just, would anybody in the panel like to react to any comments made by your co-panelist?
Oh, I would agree with Tammy about CPTPP in that ideally, to maximize leverage, Korea comes in with Taiwan and the U.S. all together, and I think it actually smooths the path for Taiwan and Korea independently. So it makes good policy sense. It's very aggressive. So I applaud you for bringing that forward.
I'd like to, something that Jimmy said about we're pushing on an open door with our partners. Again, my focus is Asia, and everybody in Asia wants to work with the U.S. They don't want us to force countries to make a choice. So, you know, many of them are damaged the same way we are by China's current practices. So I believe would be pushing on an open door.
Yeah, just a final point. I'll just echo on CPTPP. TPP. You know, we were a huge supporter of the TPP previously. You know, we're one of the most innovative industries with 20% of our revenue going back into research development. We're very focused on some of the IP protections that were elevated in the TPP. In addition, it's one of the first agreements that had a huge digital chapter for things like cross-border data flows, the deregulation of encryption products, ensuring that conformity of assessment and standards for ICT products are interoperable, voluntary, and based off of a criteria that everyone can play on. And thankfully, those were actually adopted into the USMCA. So that's a good example where work with our allies actually started in the semiconductor industry, where the semiconductor industry is a group called the World Semiconductor Council. It's a lot of acronyms for you, the WSC. But we actually pioneered and forged that digital chapter with our allies from Taiwan and Korea. And now that's both in the CPTPP and also in USMCA. And so we need to expand and scale that. Obviously, it would be great if the U.S. could join, but you know, other countries like Taiwan as well, and South Korea.
Jimmy, you mentioned that the United States semiconductors are our fourth largest export by value. Is that right? So very important industry for the United States, but one that we've almost lost several times in our past. And certainly Semitech was part of the story of saving it, but also the ability of our companies to pioneer these new value chains, especially when you look at the Japanese experience. Maybe you just provide a little bit of color historically about what it took for the U.S. to save our leadership in this industry.
Sure. So, you know, in the 1980s, the U.S. semiconductor industry at the time, you know, we invented the industry in the 50s and 60s in the United States with Intel, Fairchild Semiconductor. And by the early 1980s, Japan in particular had become highly competitive. Mixture of government policy and a closed market to competition allowed Japanese companies to become very skilled in something called DRAM or memory chip technology. And they were ultimately dumping in the U.S. market. And so the U.S. semiconductor industry worked with the U.S. government at the time to respond to some of those policies with, you know, fairly aggressive trade actions, but were targeted towards a solution. And also we, in the U.S., created something called Semitech, which was a government public-private partnership with the Pentagon to help U.S. companies regain their lead in manufacturing technology. And as a result of all of these policies, what happened is the U.S. by 1994 regained its lead in the semiconductor industry, and we've never lost it since then. But the more important sort of outcome of that is that it actually forced the majority of the U.S. industry to exit the memory chip business, given it could no longer compete on costs with their Asian-based competitors and specialize in more value-added stages of production. Again, the fabless foundry model. And it pushed some companies entirely, like Intel, to invent the microprocessor because they realized there wasn't really much of a business at the time left in memory chips. And so they invested all of their money in a big gamble in creating the brains behind all of your modern supercomputers, laptops, and PCs. And that really led and pushed Intel to the frontiers of innovation and really led to the creation of the microprocessor. So it's a perfect example where you know, competition actually created the grounds for even further success for the U.S. industry. And I would argue that competition, even in the semiconductor industry from Taiwan and South Korea, makes us better as an industry as well.
Charles, I'm going to put you on the spot. You know, I've got the easy job. I sit in my office all day and write these types of reports, but you've actually walked the halls of Congress here, and it's easy for me to say, and a set of panelists to say, pass USMCA, do the U.S. Taiwan FTA, join CPTPP, but we're about to enter an election season. How likely is it that we're going to be seeing this Congress make any movement on these types of trade agreements?
Well, it's going to make it tough, and there's something called the geography of trade, and when you think about it, it's kind of a simple concept, but when a trade agreement comes up for consideration, every single member of Congress, every senator is going to hear from individual entities, businesses, and groups within their district or their state. And oftentimes these groups will have a very narrow focus, and they'll say, you have to oppose USMCA because of some small provision in it that affects my business or my industry. This is the difficult political environment you have to deal with in any trade agreement. Now, superimpose upon that right now, where the partisanship and the political environment is as toxic as I have ever seen, and I've been in this town since 2005, and I have seen what's gone on and seen how it's evolved. Furthermore, if you go back all the way to 1934 and look at trade agreements that were, ultimately passed and implemented, a Democratic Congress has never given a Republican president a victory on a trade agreement, with the exception, I think, of Peru, which it was modified to meet some standards, and it was ripe. So history is sort of working against us. The politics, the partisanship, the outside group pressures are all working against us, which is why I go back to why this is so important. Yes, it's important commercially, and there are always winners and losers. And for those who lose out for whatever reasons, we need to upgrade our protections. We have this trade adjustment assistance program, but it's antiquated. It needs to be changed and modernized. But ultimately, the country will do better economically if we get these trade agreements. Secondly, we will be better positioned to continue to lead innovation, which is going to drive global value chain development and put the U.S. back in the lead in that. And it will ultimately allow us to shape the balance of power in geopolitical terms based on technology and economic growth with our allies. So it has benefits across the board from the micro level for economic growth, because we know trade-related industries are typically are more innovative. It opens the door for services, and services are not just the retail things you think about. Services are a lot of the IP embedded features in the value add that we export, and it's important to understand that. So strong economics, geopolitically good for us, and it helps us deal with the mercantilist growing trade problems and challenges we're seeing with China and other bad actors for that matter. So the politics are tough, and ultimately you got to take hard votes on some of these things, and you're going to have some people who are angry, but you got to do this for the good of the country, and you have to understand the arguments that underpin all of this, which is why Jimmy's report is so important.
I think you're absolutely right to see it in the commercial and the strategic context. Actually, it's an interesting story, the evolution of the global economy over the past 20 years. I mean, Jimmy, even you talked about, Japanese policy in the 1980s, which was somewhat closed door. We had some difficulties in market access, but the tenor of Japanese and Korean policy has changed very much. Tammy, you talked about, Korea doing the first FTA with Chile. Japan, as you said, Charles, was really the one that we have to thank for getting CPTPP over the line. What's changed in those countries' view of global trade policy, and what can we learn from that?
I can start with Korea. What's changed is Korea is a very small economy, and it lives in a very tough neighborhood. Japan on one side, China on the other. If China catches up to them on technology, it's game over, and they're very aware of that. So they have got to stay ahead. 70% of their GDP is directly related to trade, so they have to. And it's that knowledge and to remain competitive.
Yeah, I think, in addition, while certainly South Korea and Japan early on had, state-driven innovation policies. I think they recognize that they reached their limit in terms of the capacity they could build with that. And to expand and be more successful, they need to liberalize their economy. They need to join trade agreements. And their own companies, too, cycle back 30 years ago, Verily centrally located within Japan and South Korea. Now they're as global as U.S. companies are, and increasingly so. So they're finding that those global value chains and trade agreements can benefit them just as they do American companies.
Yeah.
That was my senior thesis at Georgetown.
Yeah, Stephen, if you go back and look at history and look at how Europe recovered after World War II, it was really about building trade capacity and bringing these devastated economies into a market which benefited the U.S. because we could export. They then developed their own industries, and robust trade developed, despite the fact that we don't have a trade agreement with the EU at this time. It could be even better if we did. But I think these Asian countries, whether it was Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, all saw the benefit of opening up and engaging robustly in trade, which has led to this significant growth, which now, you look at the Asia-Pacific region, it's the fastest growing region in the world. It's a very dynamic, robust economy across the board there. And so, yes, China is lagging in this because China has doubled down on a political system. But I think the lessons that we learned over the course of the 20th century and the power of free trade, based on high standards and rules-based, benefits everybody. And I think that's what they've learned from the examples that were set and the lessons that we learned very harshly from the 1930s.
A good example of that right now is Vietnam. Vietnam made the very courageous decision to join TPP. Right. Even though they are, a communist system, still they are one of the least developing countries in TPP. And I want to point out that TPP had a very unusual idea. Bring fully developed economies together with still developing, but agree on one common standard, one common high standard. Now, of course, Vietnam gets extra time, phase-in periods. They get capacity building help. Basically, CPTPP is helping Vietnam modernize its economy. So when my Chinese friends say, oh, we would like to join CPTPP, but the standards have got to come down, perfect rejoinder. Well, if Vietnam can do it, certainly a great nation like China. Yes, more Mai Tais, more alcohol.
When we were working on TPP in 2015, I visited a number of these TPP countries and met with prime ministers and so forth. And I remember having a conversation with the Malaysian prime minister, and he was kind of saying, well, we don't know if we can meet these standards and all this. He's kind of giving pushback. And I said, look at Singapore, just right across the way. Do you want to be Singapore, or do you want to continue to deal with all the endemic problems you have in this country? You can grow. The TPP, as Tammy said really eloquently, was really the first trade agreement that the U.S. was pushing that brought highly developed economies together with some that are really just starting to develop, Vietnam, Malaysia, to agree on high standards. And that's an earth-shattering development with big prospects for the global economy, if that would have been done with the U.S. involvement. So I'm not holding out hope. I hope we can do it, because I think other countries are
they're watching us.
They're watching.
The world is moving on. They're going. I think many Americans were surprised when Japan and Australia and Singapore pushed ahead with CPTPP. And we can blame the Canadians for the really crazy CP part of that title. But that high standard agreement with a few modifications, a lot of the really hard stuff that only the U.S. was demanding has been put on ice. But the rest of the high standard agreement is moving. And we're on the outside. Now, what does that mean for American companies in Asia? I'm spending most of my time helping American companies figure out how to take advantage of CPTPP, because it's in force, and if you're operating in Japan or Vietnam, you can use it. But who's left out? U.S.-based exporters, our farmers, And from a policy perspective, we are no longer, we don't have a chair at the table to set the rules. And that's appalling. All you young people here, you need to get out there and fix it.
Well, great. Let's open it up to the floor for questions from the audience. Please. Would you just say your name and the organization you're with, please?
Inside U.S. Trade. I want to touch on something that Stephen, you mentioned briefly, and that's export controls. Jimmy and Tammy, you both mentioned that kind of dealing with Asia is pushing out an open door. And I was wondering, commerce, and particularly BIS, is in the process of formulating a definition for emerging foundational technologies. At the same time, we have an ICT supply chain executive order and Huawei ending up on the entities list. I was wondering, are these separate policies that are obviously related, mostly geared toward China? Are we working with our allies on this, or is this something that commerce is really going alone on? I know industry is particularly interested in kind of a narrowly tailored rule on the export control side.
Sure. So, I think the U.S. semiconductor industry, we certainly understand, many of the national security implications, particularly for dual-use technology. We've been certainly responding to, and companies have been ensuring compliance to the various different export control actions that have been undertaken, whether it's with, you mentioned Huawei, or just last Friday, several companies were added to the entities list. But I think what we're also trying to help the U.S. government understand is how to balance that need to protect national security with also the economic security of one of our most critical industries, which is semiconductors. Again, the brains of all modern electronics. And the two main ways to do that is to ensure that the U.S. needs to work with its allies. As you mentioned, and as this report highlights, the U.S. semiconductor industry, while we have 45% of the world market, that means the other 55% is dominated by countries outside the United States. And so that means in many cases, they're not subject to the same export controls that U.S. companies would be. And so what we want to avoid is a situation where both the national security objective is not met, in that the entity of concern still is able to acquire the technology, and we've harmed the U.S. innovation here at home. And then second, we want to ensure that whether it's for the proposed rule on emerging technologies or other future actions, that they're narrow and specific to national security, and that we only focus on those very small subset of items that truly have a relationship to national security and have applications that do cause concern. And we don't think of these tools as something that can help advance some sort of trade policy or commercial objective. And that's really better negotiated on a table with our partners, whether it's China or other countries.
Mm-hmm. By the way, for those who didn't see it, my colleague Caleb Foote and I wrote a report that looked at the economic impact of overly stringent export controls here on the EFTs. And Caleb, we found that a most restrictive set of export controls could cost the U.S. $56 billion of economic growth over the next 5 years. Please.
Thank you. I'm Antonio from the Taiwan Embassy. I was wondering, what are the policy recommendations that you would exactly recommend to confront China, also keeping into account the Chinese counter-strikes and their damages in terms of rising import prices and damages for the U.S. agricultural sector, and if there is, besides of course rejoining the new TPP, if there is a role for American duties in that, because I guess that although American duties can be counterproductive in economic terms, they maybe can be a way to push China diplomatically and strategically into negotiations. So this would maybe be a better rationale. So that is was my question.
I'm convinced that China is not going to cave on, escalated unilateral pressure with tariffs. Based on my reading of Chinese actions and behavior, I think any any agreement would likely be unstable under these circumstances. I think what really needs to happen is to test the Chinese regime's capacity and will to open up further and to reform, which will require political reforms, which is going to be exceedingly difficult if you go back and look at Chinese history dating back to Mao. The only way to do this is to maximize aggregate pressure, bringing in allies. Not going to be easy, but I think there are a number of ways to try to construct this sequentially to try to build it. But it will take time, and it will take really good diplomacy to make it happen. Tariffs, I believe, and the way they are being used are counterproductive because the administration is using tariffs also on allies that we need to bring in, and that's counterproductive. And secondly, it's causing a lot of economic collateral damage in the U.S. So I think the smart China policy for the United States would be to back off of all these tariffs on our allies, maybe continue with some pressure with tariffs in the short term on China directly to get to the table and hold negotiations while we build allies to help us in a concerted way to apply pressure. And then to minimize vulnerabilities, I do believe that we know there are limitations with export controls. Even in the Cold War, when it was much simpler, there was a significant amount of diffusion of technology, both legal and illegal, to the communist bloc. And oftentimes the U.S. with allies could not even agree upon what should be on the list. And that's even got more complicated today with technology. So I agree with Jimmy's approach. You got to really keep it limited to where there's a clear national security prerogative, but we should do it with allies. And if we, for instance, were to work with our market-based allies and security allies on established lists where we jointly work together and share information, we're going to be more effective than if we each try to do it separately alone. So I think there's a way to marshal allied strength in protecting our vulnerabilities, while at the same time getting a concerted strategy with allies to maximize pressure on China to test it. And if China still doesn't reform, then the consequence is not containment of China. It's simply China's choosing to isolate itself from global value chains that we are establishing through trade agreements. There's a real important distinction between, trying to impose containment on China, which is not going to work, but at the same time creating terms that are less favorable for China so that they feel the pressure. And if they still don't make the political reforms, well, then we'll see some level of decoupling. But we'll go into decoupling in a much more advantageous position with consolidated global value chains as opposed to going into it as we're doing now, where we're not in a prime position in our global value chains and we're extremely vulnerable.
To build on what Congressman Boustany said, there is a trilateral negotiation on non-market economy right now between the U.S., the EU, and Japan. I'd love to see us broaden that out. A lot of countries would, South Korea being one of them, would welcome the opportunity. And referencing using or perhaps misusing national security exemptions, I'm afraid that we are teaching potential bad actors bad things. Mm-hmm. We will see this again. No one believes that steel and aluminum or autos and auto parts are a true national security threat to the United States. When you have our former Defense Secretary Mattis saying he did not think steel and aluminum imports were a threat, but if we slap the tariffs on our allies, that could create a threat. The world's watching, folks, and what we're doing is wrong.
So I think just one additional point, to the extent that, as Congressman Boustany pointed out, the technology and China's economic model is a challenge for the United States, I think we need to recognize that there's only so much that the U.S. can do in terms of containment, and it's going to be ultimately ineffective, and that the best way to sustain America's advantage in technology is to invest in our own innovation capabilities and maximize our partnerships with the global value chain. And what does that mean? It means faced with a declining student population in the U.S. that's interested in STEM and science degrees, and faced with a declining federal investment in public funding for research and development, well, we need to do two things. We need to expend more resources for R&D and for workforce training. And in particular, think about, and again, as I referenced in the 1980s, when the U.S. semiconductor industry was faced with a challenge from Japan, well, what did we do? Ultimately, it was our investment in our innovation that propelled our leadership. And in fact, the Semiconductor Industry Association released earlier this year a blueprint called Win the Future, where we talk about the need to triple federal investment in semiconductor-related research development. And if we do that, then we're guaranteed to win the race for whether it's 5 or 6G, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, because there's a horizon of innovation that companies are able to fund on their own, and there's much longer term that both can benefit the government and industry, and that's where we hope the U.S. government can focus its resources on. And so we can, try and control things all we want, but ultimately it's about how do we sustain our technological leadership.
I would just add that my colleague Nigel Corey and I have a paper out front called Confronting Chinese Innovation Mercantilism, a Doctrine of Alliance-Based Constructive Confrontation, which lays out 30 specific ideas, but I'll pretty much endorse what you've just said. One thing I think we should do, the USTR has a wonderful report called the National Trade Estimate Foreign Barriers Report each year, which lays out market access barriers that trading partners put in place. We should work with all countries in the world that have been negatively affected by Chinese innovation mercantilism to create a bill of particulars that lays out, for all countries how they've been affected by unfair Chinese trade practices. At the same time, we need to bring more cases to the WTO, and we particularly need to insist that China abide by its requirements to notify subsidies to the WTO in a timely manner and to stop introducing subsidies at a level that put them in violation of the ASEM agreement. Yes, please.
In short term, I don't see an opportunity for this president to rejoin, but I do think the next administration, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, will. One of the things I think that will make the environment easier, and our CPTPP potential partners are working on it, is to ensure that when that appropriate time comes, that they can show progress, that they can show that the dispute resolution works. In implementing any high standard agreement, there are always implementation problems, and there will be some. They will be starting with Vietnam, and they need to use those processes to show that it works. So that, again, at an appropriate time when the political environment here is more open, then I think absolutely the U.S. will join.
I agree with Tammy. I think with regard to the political environment, the dynamics with regard to China and the threat perception is going to drive this. But I think it will be very important as we look at that prospect of going back into CPTPP, not to talk about it as containment. I think what we should do is say we're setting the highest possible standards. China can join, but you got to meet the standards. Meet the standards. That's how we should be talking about it. That's how we should drive the debate. Because if we talk about containment, first off, it's self-defeating, and it's really not going to be the best way to go about keeping our allies together on this. We want to coalesce around standards, drive global value chains, promote innovation and economic growth, and let China see that, hey, if they don't reform, and they don't meet these standards, they're going to find themselves falling more and more behind.
The reason that containment is a terrible idea is that today China is everyone in Asia's #1 trade partner.
Right.
If we force them to choose, they don't have a choice. They will I mean, and also they're in the neighborhood. They're right there. So countries don't want to choose. They want the U.S. there. They want us part of the architecture, and we need to get back to it.
And that flip, where China is now the #1 trading partner for all these countries, that happened in the last decade or so, basically since China joined the WTO. So that's how quickly everything has changed, and it's accelerating even more now because we are not engaged in trade agreements.
Yeah, you know, in 1991, China had $200 million in foreign currency reserves.
Yeah.
Today they have $4 trillion.
Right.
I see two more questions. Why don't we take them together, and then we will answer them together, and we will adjourn. Go ahead.
So where do you see the role of multinational corporations in breaking their supply lines through China and creating a global value chain?
Identify yourself, please.
I'm Liam Black with Senator Gardner, sorry.
Great. And Emily?
I'm Emily Benson from the Burleson Foundation, and thank you all for your thoughts and for hosting. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on how the ongoing U.S.-China conflict will affect Taiwan.
Y'all got those two questions?
Both really important questions. I think first off, even prior to the trade war between us and China, multinationals were looking at lower labor costs. They were shifting supply chains, global value chains into Southeast Asia and they're looking for other areas. So that's sort of a trend. It's now accelerated, particularly over the last year because of all the uncertainty about what's going to happen between U.S. and China. It doesn't change what we ought to be doing. And what we ought to be doing is building linkages, as we've talked about earlier, to insinuate the U.S. and put the U.S. in the best possible position in all of this. It's important strategically as well as economically and for the sake of innovation. But I think the trend's already been ongoing. It's just accelerating now because of the perceived threat that we are seeing with China. And the second question was Taiwan. I was in Taiwan right before that last set of local elections, and the Chinese were very actively engaged with an influence operation, infiltration into different entities. They recognize our codependence on Taiwan in technology, as Jimmy has laid out so eloquently. They know that if they can get their hands on this, this will give them the opportunity to leap in innovation because they'll get access to technology that they currently can't do them on their own at the pace that they're going. They're looking for that breakthrough, and so with the next election in Taiwan for president, there's a tremendous amount of pressure mounting to get pro-Chinese elements into office in key positions, including the presidency, and that's the risk. The U.S. is, I think, this administration is awakening to that threat, and we need to take it very seriously because this is one of those. I mean, if you look at what's going on in technology, and I'm not the expert that Jimmy is on this, we have the advantage in semiconductors. They seem to be ahead of us with the 5G race right now. And what's holding them back on a lot of things is the need to get access to the high-end, high-value semiconductor technology. And the quickest way for them to do that is to get Taiwan. And that's why it's so important. I don't know, Jimmy, you want to?
Yeah, I think first on the supply chain question, China for the semiconductor industry is worldwide around a third of all semiconductors are consumed in China. And China imports more semiconductors than oil. And so because of that, nearly 60 to 70% of all the world's chips pass through China. And that's because nearly all phones, laptops, TVs, smart devices, electronics are assembled there. And so that market itself, China is so huge. And then the rest of the world is also so huge that while the U.S. has tariffs on imports from China, the rest of the world doesn't. And so China can and will likely continue to be the production base for companies that want to compete in China, but also the rest of the world. And so that's another example of where tariffs on products from China we're seeing right now are not necessarily creating the leverage we need with China, where we can gain better leverage with our allies, and they're putting U.S. companies at a disadvantage. I would argue that in the short term, yes, you might see signs of companies rearranging things to, particularly on the electronics assembly, to have their widget be manufactured in Malaysia for the U.S. market, but everything else is still staying in China. So it's just such a huge market that the incentives to disentangle that are impossible to think of. In terms of Taiwan, I would just again emphasize, particularly with the increasing tensions with the U.S. and China, it's an opportunity for the U.S. and Taiwan to strengthen our partnerships, particularly as they relate to technology, cross-border R&D, to help us be stronger and more competitive vis-a-vis China with intellectual property protection, given that there's all this semiconductor technology sitting in Taiwan that China wants really badly. Unfortunately, we've seen examples of intellectual property theft by state-owned Chinese entities on Taiwanese entities. And so more cross-border collaboration, law enforcement, information sharing would be highly successful to help our two countries be competitive.
And here we have a democratic, market-based country that wants to engage in global forums and advocate for those principles on an international level. Not seeing any more questions. Let me ask the final one and we'll wrap it up. President Trump and Prime Minister Xi Jinping will meet on the sidelines of the G20 Forum in Japan this weekend on Saturday. What are your expectations?
I'll start with that. I think there'll probably be a nice, vigorous handshake and an agreement to get back to some discussion, some negotiation, but I'm not optimistic that anything that's negotiated under the current circumstances and current approach will lead to a stable agreement. It may lead to a little political reprieve to get through the 2020 election, but I'm not optimistic about the approach. I think the approach that we've all outlined will be much more sustainable and effective in the long run.
The real question I have is China has three asks. They want a balanced agreement, they want reasonable purchase requests, and the big one, which is my big question, what happens to current tariffs? The Chinese want them all gone. I think this administration will likely keep the first tranche of the $50 billion because, frankly, those were strategic, and those actually hurt the Chinese more than they hurt us, unlike some of the recent ones.
Right.
So I think it's certainly an opportunity for both sides to try and get back to the negotiating table. Whether or not that happens, I leave that to both the congressman and Tammy to speculate. I think what we do want to ensure, though, is if there is a deal that comes out of the G20, and more likely it's an agreement, a handshake to continue negotiating a deal, it needs to be high standard, and it needs to be something that, like the CPTPP, is going to create incentives for China to protect intellectual property, to limit the role of the state in its economy, to ensure that its markets are open to U.S. multinational companies. And if it doesn't achieve that, then we're not meeting the potential that it needs to be.
Well, great. Well, video of this event will be posted online within 24 hours. And I would like to thank first the audience for coming this morning, and also our esteemed panel, Charles, Tammy, and Jimmy. Thank you so much for being with us.
Of course, yeah.